Hi, everybody. Today we are going to continue talking about the reproductive system. Now, the other day we started to go over some of the anatomy, and we talked about the female and the male anatomy. And today, what we're going to do is we are going to talk about some of the processes that happen in the female and the male. Now that we know the anatomy, we can figure out what's going on. So first, we need to talk about some of the important events that happen in the uterus and in the ovaries. So one important event is called ovulation. Ovulation is when an egg gets released from an ovary. This happens once a month. So every approximately 30 days, 28 to 30 days, an egg is released from one of those ovaries. Now, something that can happen after ovulation, so only after an egg is released. Sometimes fertilization can occur. So fertilization is when a sperm cell joins the egg cell, and those two haploid cells, remember sperm cells and egg cells are haploid. So those two haploid cells are going to combine and become one diploid cell. So that diploid cell is going to be called a zygote. A fertilized egg, two haploid nuclei become one diploid nuclei. That is a zygote. So the N represents haploid. So a haploid cell plus a haploid cell equals 2N. 2N is a diploid cell. And after fertilization, pregnancy can occur, which is when the embryo starts developing and it develops in the uterus. Okay, so here is a lecture check. Put the following events in order. We have 3 events here: pregnancy, ovulation, fertilization. Take a moment to put these events in the correct order. All right, and the correct order should be ovulation has to happen first, and none of these things can happen if an egg doesn't get released, followed by fertilization, and then pregnancy can only occur once an egg has been fertilized. Okay, what else do we need to know? We need to know that these events are caused by hormones. So female reproductive hormones, there's 4 of them. 2 of them are made by the brain, and 2 of them are made by the ovaries. So they're made in different places. The pituitary hormones are made by a gland called the pituitary gland. You can see it up there. I'll use the laser pointer to point it out. The pituitary gland is sort of in the middle of the brain. So if you imagine going back and on the side, that pituitary gland is making something called FSH. This follicle stimulating hormone is going to develop the egg. So it's going to make the egg get ready for ovulation. And then LH, or luteinizing hormone, that's going to cause ovulation. So this hormone's the actual thing that's going to make the ovary release the egg. Then we have ovarian hormones. These are the 2 hormones made by the ovaries, and you actually already know these from the other day. There is estrogen. Estrogen develops the uterus in case of pregnancy. And then there's progesterone. Progesterone also develops the uterus during pregnancy. So both of these hormones kind of have a very similar function. They help develop the uterus, and they help the uterus become very thick. It gets filled with blood so that it's a good place to raise an embryo. All right. Which hormones are made by the brain and which hormones are made by the ovaries? Take a moment and answer this question now. All right, made by the brain are the pituitary hormones. That's FSH, the hormone which develops the egg, and LH, that's the hormone that causes ovulation. Made by the ovaries are estrogen and progesterone. Both of these develop the uterus in case of pregnancy. All right, here's lecture check number 2. What is the function of these things? I just mentioned it, so take a moment and write down those functions now. Again, estrogen developing the uterus, LH causing ovulation, FSH developing the egg, and progesterone developing the uterus. Okay. So hormones control the events in the ovary and in the uterus. So hormones are going to develop the egg. We know which one does that, right? It's FSH. Hormones are going to cause ovulation or the release of the egg. And again, that's LH. And hormones are going to thicken the uterus to prepare it for pregnancy. So some of the hormones work on the ovaries, right? FSH and LH work on to they come from your brain, they work on the ovaries to develop and release the egg. And then estrogen and progesterone come from the ovaries and work on the uterus to develop it. So here we have a picture of the egg developing. So the egg, notice that we're developing the cells around the egg is the little pink thing in the middle. So the cells around the egg are growing and preparing it for ovulation and fertilization. Okay, here is egg development. We can see over time the egg is getting bigger. And then here, right here, this one that I'm highlighting, this is ovulation. See how the egg is breaking out of the ovary. This happens about every 28 days. And where is this egg going to go once it's released? Where is its next stop? It's going to go through these tubes, either the one on the left or the one on the right. The fallopian tubes, also known as the oviducts, are going to carry the egg to the uterus. And if that egg gets fertilized, it is going to implant in the uterus and start growing. If not, it's just going to go out. All right, there are two ways that hormones affect the body. There is something called negative feedback, and then there is something called positive feedback. Negative feedback is when one event reduces the effects of something else. When I like to think of negative feedback, I think of a car speeding. Right? You're driving a little faster and a little faster on the highway, and suddenly you see a police car up above. You don't want to get a ticket, so you start tapping on the brakes, right? You lower your speed. That's a negative feedback, right? One action inhibits the other. You tapping on the brakes, that is going to inhibit your car from going faster. Negative feedback helps us maintain homeostasis, right? If we get too hot, if our temperature goes up, then negative feedback causes us to sweat, and that helps us push our temperature back down where it belongs, right? If we have too much glucose in our blood, then we release insulin, and insulin helps bring glucose down to where it belongs. Negative feedback maintains homeostasis. It helps keep us nice and constant. Positive feedback, on the other hand, is going to do something that's different. Positive feedback is going to be when one event amplifies another event. So imagine you're in a race. You're driving and you want to keep going faster and faster and faster, right? Because you want to win the race. So you keep accelerating instead of pumping the brakes. That's positive feedback. Positive feedback is not maintaining homeostasis. It's the opposite. It's like defying or disrupting homeostasis. If you are making more and more and more and more of something, that's very different than making sure you have a constant level. So this is like a continual increase of something, as if you were to keep putting the gas pedal to the floor and you were to keep going faster and faster. That would be positive feedback. You keep making something happening more and more. An example of negative feedback is something that's going to happen in our bodies. When the ovaries make estrogen and progesterone, the body doesn't want to make too much of these two hormones. So what estrogen and progesterone do is they go back to the brain. This is the brain, the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and your brain makes FSH and LH. So what happens is, to prevent us from making too many hormones, when estrogen and progesterone are created, they actually go back to your brain and they tell your brain to slow down. Don't make so much hormone. Don't make so much LH and FSH, and in turn, we won't make so much estrogen and progesterone. It's a way of pumping the brakes, making sure we're not getting too much of one hormone. So negative feedback is a way of self-regulation, regulating how much of something that we're going to make. Positive feedback, on the other hand, is going to not be pumping the brakes. Instead, it's going to be pushing the gas pedal. So during labor, so when a mother is about to deliver a baby, oxytocin is going to be created by the brain. This is a hormone, and it's going to cause the uterus to start contracting. And when the uterus contracts, what it's doing is it's basically helping to push the baby out of the uterus. So pregnancy and delivery. So what happens? Oxytocin tells the uterus to start contracting, and it tells the cervix, which is the opening, the entrance of the uterus, it tells it to start to stretch, start to open up because pregnancy is happening. So as those two things happen, as the cervix begins stretching open and as the uterus begins contracting, that action is actually going to go back to your brain. Your brain is going to pick up on that action, and it's going to say, all right, we are delivering the baby, produce more oxytocin. So we're hitting the gas pedal, more oxytocin is released, which tells your uterus to contract even more, which tells the cervix to stretch even more, which is then going to push the baby out even a little bit more. And that pressure from all that stuff happening is going to send it to your brain, which is going to make more oxytocin, which is going to cause the contractions to happen faster. And that's going to cause the cervix to open up even more, which will make your brain make even more oxytocin. And it's this whole circle that keeps going. More oxytocin, more contractions, more cervical opening, and again, and again, and again. And it's this spiral that keeps increasing, and that is positive feedback. And it doesn't end until delivery. After delivery, the whole positive feedback loop shuts down and it's over. So positive feedback is not something that happens forever. It happens just for a short time. So oxytocin causes the uterus to contract. The contracting pushes the baby. The cervix widens, which tells your brain to produce more oxytocin, which then, we go back to the top, oxytocin causes the uterus to contract even more. All right, how does the reproductive system maintain homeostasis through negative feedback? That's your first question. Please answer that now. All right, so you should have mentioned how as the body produces estrogen and progesterone, it goes back to your brain and tells your brain to stop making so many hormones. So it's a way of self-regulation. Question 2, why is it necessary for oxytocin to aid in positive feedback? Answer this question now. Okay, so oxytocin is going to tell your uterus to contract more, which is going to open up your cervix more, which is then going to produce more oxytocin. And this is the only way that the uterus can contract enough and the cervix can open enough to deliver the baby. So it's necessary to get the baby delivered. All right, so we already covered all of this. So we have one more thing to cover, and it's about the male hormones, testosterone. And this is going to be pretty short. It's one of our last things today. Testosterone is the hormone produced by the testes, and it has two functions. Testosterone is going to help develop the testes and other male sex characteristics, and it's also going to help produce the sperm. The sperm cannot be produced without the aid of the hormone testosterone helping to direct the production. So there's only one hormone here that we need to know, and it's a little bit less complicated because there's not the getting parts ready for the fetus to grow. So it's a little bit simpler, right? And that is testosterone. We can see that testosterone is going to aid in sperm growth and development. And that is all we have for today. So let me know if you have any questions.